He looks younger. So my role today is to get everybody thinking into the future far enough that you can disassociate from all of the steps that are required to get there. And in order to do that, I have a couple of just real quick questions, and I have a couple of things I want to cover with you, and then I'll set up for questions. When futurists and pundits and old farts like myself stand in front of crowds like this, we really need the help from difficult questions. Ichihan gave what I think was one of the best presentations I've ever seen on AI, and one of the reasons why it was so good is because it talked about productivity, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that when we get into this. But just to get started, how many people have seen Minority Report? Excellent. How many people can write in more than one programming language? How many people can read in more than 5 programming languages? Okay. Now, I want to emphasize, let's start off with a couple of facts. I can read in 14 programming languages. I learned Python last year. I learned R the year before. And I found that in order to do what I do for a living, I absolutely had to learn how these languages are designed and what they are able to produce. My first language, of course, was BASIC, because you can tell I was born in 1951. So, you know, BASIC at the age of 14 was just coming into practice. I got thrown out of math class for being a little bit difficult, and because I'd been thrown out of private school in the middle of the year. And then I got sent up as a junior in high school. I got sent up to the math club, so that sort of as exile, where the seniors were sitting around smoking cigarettes, and they didn't want anything to do with the junior. So I went into the next room, and there was a teletype terminal and a couple of big cups that took a hand thing for a modem. And it was wrapped in bubble wrap. It had been provided by the Ford Foundation to connect to the Dartmouth system. And since that day, I type now with 2 fingers, these 2 fingers, because the teletype terminal was so hard you had to push down to cut the paper tape. And then you'd run the paper tape in. And as a young, pimply-faced Greenwich kid who'd been thrown out of Brunswick and was kicked over to the high school, I found it much easier to talk to the computer. Truthfully, I don't like people that much. And this has influenced my whole career. I started off at Bankers Trust in what was then the first ever quantitative group. We built index funds. We did the first program trading. We did the first electronic trading. I then formed a bunch of companies. I went to SEI, ran an AI company called Inference for a while, learned both Lisp and a meta language called ART. And the guy that founded that company had a license plate that said Infer, and I was this president, so my license plate said Imply. He wasn't amused. I was fired after 11 months. The Rockefeller family had put me in there to bring maturity to an AI company. This is literally 30 some odd years ago, in the first wave of AI. I learned then that you can't actually change a culture. You can just sit on top of it and get killed and expelled by it. So even though I learned Lisp and I learned ART and I negotiated and got us great contracts and all that sort of stuff, when we tried to convert the underlying language from Lisp to C++, they went revolution and said, get him out of here. So where is AI going? Well, when we think about AI from the standpoint of data science, most of what was put up here earlier today becomes irrelevant. How many people know how to use a compass, read a map, do what we used to call orienteering? Notice not too many, and they're all old. Well, except for you. You've obviously been in Outward Bound or something like that, forced by your parents probably. So, no. How do you get to grandma's house? You tell your phone you want to go there. How do you get a cab? You know, the strategy for getting a cab is a deep algorithm here in New York. Deep algorithm. And often it involves going to streets that are going the other direction from where you're going because the volume is better there, all replaced. Taxi drivers in the age of Uber, spats and top hats in the age of Kennedy and Eisenhower. So we are moving toward the technology adapting to the human being. And I want to emphasize that when people think about AI, they think about it backwards in a sense. We obsess with how things are done. How things are done is really not that crucial at the end of the day. What is crucial is what is done and what is the recursive, interactive nature of technology with the human spirit. By way of example, how many people here ever programmed in COBOL? So if I were asking this question, and again, it's the old farts, right? I mean, really, we talk about obsolescence. You know, I learned COBOL as like my 7th or 8th language, and it almost killed me. I had been used to languages where you sat at the terminal and you typed in and it interpreted. The point being that technology ultimately serves human purposes. And at the end of the day, and at the end of the AI revolution, which we are at best 1/3 of the way through, how the system works will become as irrelevant as understanding how the Doppler effect works in GPS. Yes, it works. Sure, there are people who care. How many satellites? What is the Doppler delay? How do you record the time period? How does that tell you? But why does GPS work as a behavioral thing? How many people's wives or spouses use GPS? All of us, right? Now, not meaning to be sexist, but with a little bit of, why does my mother use GPS? Because when she turned it on, it told her where she was, and she was about where it said. And that was magic. Sergey Brin once said that Google had only 2 things that account for its entire success. One is that speed is equivalent to magic. Doing anything faster than expected is magical and creates a magical experience. And the second one, which is not widely publicized, but I recommend it to you as a way to think about this interaction that's going on, he recognized something really remarkable, which was that in a room where there's a computer and a person, the valuable commodity was the attention of the person, not the productive capacity of the computer. And therefore, what you would charge for was not the computer. You couldn't charge the computer. You couldn't charge the person for the computer. You had to deliver the computer in return for the attention. Because attention is the one thing which in our lives is not reproducible, right? I have all of your attention. And thank you very much. You're all dying just a little inside, I know, as we sit here talking. But that is the point, is it not? This is the scarce commodity. The scarce commodity is time and choice and association and affiliation. In the world that comes in the post-AI world, the scarce commodity is those human characteristics: time, attention, community, association, etc. And all of the traditional architectures will break down. If we acknowledge that the internet is a profound change in the universe, right? What's your nomination? And I'll give you Moore's law and the internet. In other words, I'm talking about bandwidth and compute power. So now we have bandwidth and compute power are effectively infinite. Now, they're not infinite today. They're not infinite tomorrow. Do you think there'll be effectively an infinite utility in, how many people think 5 years? How many people think 30? Within 30 years. I think you're all wrong. It's going to be somewhere in the 5 to 10 year horizon, for all intents and purposes, whether you call it a utility or don't, an infinite ability to access digital information, an infinite bandwidth and infinite compute power, asymptotic to infinite, right? Or asymptotic to infinite, if you want to think of it that way. Cost goes this way. Is in the predictable future. And for many of you in this room, it will define the midpoint of your careers. And for many of you in this room, it could define the end of your careers, to the extent that you define your career in terms of manufacturing a better spindle or a better steam engine, a la the Industrial Revolution. You have to start to think now about the world that is coming. And when that world arrives, what will be disrupted? Well, a lot of things will be disrupted, right? I mean, I'm not talking about Airbnb and all that sort of stuff, the share economy. These are offering massive social changes. It's totally unremarkable to talk about the massive social changes to come. Most of what people have done that demonstrated value, in other words, in an industrialized economy where it uses money as a currency, will become obsolete in one form or another. It'll become either obsolete or commoditized, et cetera. But when you think about that world, what will be the proximate causes of it? My nomination for the most disruptive and under-recognized technology today, even with all the hype, is distributed ledger systems, or blockchain. Does anybody here ever watch false news? Do we not all? Does anyone know what good news is? Not good news, sorry. Real news. Well, it used to be based on where it came from. It used to be based on an authoritative figure, the newspaper of record, the source that you trusted, the pulpit, your boss, the government, etc. All of these have been massively degraded. What replaces it? Verification replaces it. Verification will be distributed. Distributed ledger systems will not just destroy banks and custodians and intermediaries who have been the authoritative figure to express a number. It will destroy things like newspapers. It will ultimately completely rework the job market. How many people have lied in the course of their lives? Not right now, of course, because I know everyone here is telling the absolute truth at all times right now. But how many people here have lied at some point, to some degree, in the course of obtaining a job, either on a resume or in a form or in a discussion? How many people have not lied? You liars! You lying sacks of poo. It's not true. You know it's not true. The point is, and we know this, 65% of resumes contain at least one factual error. 40% of resumes and job applications contain an outright lie, either a time period that's missing or whatever. There are 5 or 6 companies being formed right now that are making use of the internet and distributed ledger systems to simply say, this is a certified truth. This is an actual truth. This is a fact that's been verified. If you just cast that out 10 years, you can see, now, we are talking about disruption. What is it that gets disrupted? What is it that gets disrupted? Any nominations? Anybody want to make a nomination for something that gets disrupted? What's the class of entity that gets disrupted? Intermediaries, I buy that. It's economic aggregations. The government's been disrupted by false news in the news cycle, right? The corporations are going to be disrupted. At the end of the day, Marshall McLuhan only wrote one decent book, not the second one. He missed the second book. The prospect of the global economy and the ultimate post-AI universe is 2 things. One, robots are real. They're virtual, but they're real. I mean, I know there's a guy in Florida making sex toys that talk, but this guy obviously has never been married. I mean, it's just, talk about a niche market, so to speak. But no, but in all seriousness, we all obsess about the physical robots. Who cares about the physical robots? Your phone is going to be an implant in a matter of a fairly short period of time. It's not going to need to be dealt with physically. Offices are already largely virtual. So what robots are going to do, what Siri's going to do, where do we think these things go? Do we think the rate of change is slowing on these advisors and anticipators of our needs? People like you like this movie. What ends up happening is that the universe goes from communal to bespoke. It's not the power of the individual to use the technology that makes a difference in the next 20 years. It's the power of the technology to intermediate and cushion the individual, to create a personal universe, a personal set of news stories, a personal set of community of relations. Those relations are non-physical relationships. I watched my daughter, who is 30 some odd years old, notwithstanding the story I'm about to tell, sit with her boyfriend on a couch that was no longer than this, and with the TV on, sharing stuff on their phones and laughing at it. Like, conversation is the new app, I wanted to say. But truthfully, conversation isn't. Conversation is the old app. And she does this, and if you ever look at the pattern of use of technology by younger people, they do not use technology the same way we think of technology. They use technology as a replacement for community, and the community is effectively global. The first year of college has 3 times as many psychological reports as it did in the 1950s and 60s. Why? Any nomination as to why? Because people never leave high school. They're still texting with their high school buddies who are elsewhere. There is no forced sense of community of the sort that used to require bonding. In the financial services world, what this means is, and I should mention I'm a quant myself, so notwithstanding all this futurist nonsense, I'd be happy to talk about actual things like alpha and principal components and so on. What this means is that we are going to have to go, and now this is to the topic of the conference, we are going to need to drill down and relate to the data. The value of human intuition and instinct is not dead. It is not over, but it is changing. The credibility of an unexplainable insight is asymptotic to 0. A genius moment can still be very powerful. But in most activities, portfolio management particularly, if you can't explain why you believe it or understand why it's believable, it's going to be increasingly difficult to execute on it. Purely intuitive behaviors of all sorts are going to be degraded. Now, they're not going to be degraded because they are not part of the computer world. They're going to be degraded because they don't work as well. Science actually works better than people do. In our industry, financial services, for better or for worse, we use science poorly. We use science very poorly in financial services. We use it for very clumsy things. It's sort of like using your iPad as a hammer. It is amazing. If Boeing made airplanes the way people build portfolios, they'd be a railroad company. We have got to upgrade all of this. And what this means is that there will be no such thing as an investment committee in the old-fashioned sense. There will be no such thing as large teams in the old-fashioned sense. Industries that use science well use science in very small teams, the interaction among which is not only fairly unstructured, but it is subject to a special class of management. It's not pyramidal management, it's ad hoc, flat organizations. The biotech world is an example of that. So what I'm trying to encourage you to think about is the fact that today I learned Python to understand what's possible. Tomorrow I express what I require, and the system learns English to execute on my vision. Today, the valuable commodity is a cycle or bandwidth. If time is the only irreducible commodity, what is the valuable commodity tomorrow? It's the attention span of the scientist. What is the right response time for a query in terms of learning something like BPM? It takes about 90 seconds for a scientist to be distracted. If the answer is not within 90 seconds, there's a very high probability, and scientists have known this since the days of Freud, there's a very high probability that by the time the answer comes back, it will not be part of the creative process anymore. In order for information to integrate into the true creativity of the human being, it needs to be as fast as thought. And that is very close to happening. Many of our portfolio companies, we own a number of money management and trading companies, many of our portfolio companies now have a standard that if you're talking to the computer, if you're relating to the computer, it needs to relate at the same speed as would a colleague or better, and preferably with higher degrees of utility. Next, suggestions. There are several AI languages where when you construct AI approaches, I don't believe MATLAB does this, but there's a version of this that does. I think it's run at UCSD, where when you're building your building blocks to move from data to hypothesis or insight, looking for validation, it tells you if you're about to put a block in the wrong place. And it does that because it knows something that no one researcher can know. It knows what's worked all the way through to conclusion in 1,000 prior episodes. So yes, you can put the screening up here instead of down here, but by the way, fewer people have succeeded that way. Most of the time, the leg bone connects to the ankle bone. So why don't we try it that way? This interaction is going to dominate, and it's going to reduce the utility of the human contribution to the point where, and this is my wrap up, it'll reduce the human contribution to the point where the economic model that was proposed by Tokyo Marine becomes dominant. The computer ends up creating what technology has always created since the dawn of the bone as a weapon. It creates productivity. Productivity, in the final analysis, means getting more things done for less money and resource and risk. And unfortunately, that means, well, many of us here in 20 years will be dead, but for many of us who are not dead, we will be facing extraordinarily challenging times in economic terms, because the human revolution in reaction to technology is proceeding geometrically and will continue to proceed geometrically. And with that really positive vision about the utopia to come, may I ask for a couple of quick questions? Take it away.
Aren't you overlooking the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. The status quo and the people who want to disintermediate, like Walter Isaacson, create two internets and bifurcate them there. Eventually, you're right, the technology will overcome them, but doesn't it take a number of years, and maybe even a generation, of them disintermediating things? When the internet first came on, I could have all the free emails I wanted. I could search anywhere and anything without Google interrupting me and saying, oh, you might be a terrorist, so I can't show you that. But, the powers that be, to keep us safe and everything, have taken those capabilities away. And won't they continue to, make America great again by keeping foreign sources away and thus, lowering the curve that technology could otherwise take in speeding up progress?
Yes, is the short answer. And I think you're exactly right. And that's one of the reasons why I always say, think about this in a 10-year horizon or a 15-year horizon, because there are very powerful countervailing sources. Every progressive in the world believes that we should regulate taxi drivers into permanent existence because taxi unions are powerful. Well, bullshit, But how long will it take to unwind that? The big one that's coming, of course, is the really, really tough problem of human subsistence. And that has the potential to rip up whole governments and economic systems. Next question? Yeah.
Thank you for the insightful talk. My question is regarding the example which you mentioned about Boeing building the aeroplane which can fly, and how we in the finance industry are not utilizing our full potential. So essentially, science can be extrapolated to our ultimate ambition of theory of everything. But when we come to the markets, there is a feedback loop. nature has a feedback loop which has potentially a response time of much longer duration, while markets, especially with more machines coming into picture, is responding much faster. And there are so many humans and masses which are completely different, and people who are so much different. So do you think it is possible to model a theory of everything for markets by your?
No, and by the way, this is a subject on which I've written a number of academic articles and contributed to a number of academic articles. So, so let me make two observations that'll enlighten on this specific issue. One of the things that, that we do at a couple of our portfolio companies that specialize in AI is we look for people outside of from other industries who have used science much more precisely to accomplish what we think of as much simpler jobs, like finding oil. Okay, finding oil using cluster attributes instead of geologists is now in its 20th year. Productivity has gone up maybe 5 to 10-fold. When you look at it just as economic productivity, accuracy has gone up maybe 10-fold. And those are very important things when you're looking for oil. But at the end of the day, looking for oil is a pretty easy thing. You know why? Because the amount of oil there isn't influenced by the amount of looking you do for it. There is a fixed amount of oil. This is what we call a static problem. Medicine, another example. The use of AI in medicine is extremely extensive, particularly in diagnostic and research activities. But the reason that it can be used with such confidence is that the problem is not recursive. You're right. The number of times, false positives and false negatives are equally valid, but you are not going to find somebody, you're not going to be using it on a non-carbon-based life form tomorrow. Everybody that comes into the emergency room has got the same biology, basically, or discernible differences. Markets are inherently recursive, much more recursive, and they are also inherently behavioral. And therefore, it is a mistake to think about the objectives of AI as modeling markets. You can model static events. You can even model dynamic linear events. You cannot model non-dynamic, non-linear events. What you can do is relate the past dynamics to the future probabilities. In medicine, if you cannot get a 95% correct positive, correct negative rate, you do not have something that is useful. In money management, how many of us would take a 55% sign prediction any day of the week? Forget 70, 80. Our idea of a good prediction is one that's just a little less noisy than the real world. And the null value hypothesis is mostly useful in those recurrent circumstances. There's one other observation I will make, and that is, and this is the second half of the answer there. The enemy to the way we use science in a recursive behavioral marketplace is our own heuristics. And one of our most dangerous heuristics, the one that I particularly recommend you try to root and branch in yourself, is the tendency to name things. There are principal components that statistically explain the behavior of securities, right? You might think that the first principal component is the market, but by naming it, and Noam Chomsky studied this for his whole career, by naming it, you have objectified it and made it static. It isn't the market, it's the first principal component. The accuracy of that description is essential. What do we think the value of the first principal component is in economic terms? What's Schwab charging for it today? 3 basis points. Doesn't support a business. What's the second principal component? What's the value of that in the marketplace? If I want to own something and I want to own a market, I can own it for 3 basis points. If I want to own the second principal component, I can own it for 10 to 15 basis points. If I want to own truly idiosyncratic returns that are inherently unpredictable and orthogonal to these other principal components, not factors like value. Bar Rosenberg should burn in hell for naming these factors. That was his great crime, not falsifying the research and putting Axel Rosenberg out of business. So I think that it's the human in the human systems interaction that is the danger point in why we are so inefficient. Now, that is not to say I believe in unsupervised learning, and it is not to say that I believe in new data sources instead of better analysis of longer detailed digital data. But I do, as a competitive matter, endorse all of you focusing all of your attention on brand new shallow data sources, so that my statisticians and double PhDs can go back and figure out what really happened in the last 50 years and try to apply it to tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time today.
This is RavenPack.